morning, afternoon, evening, or late night to students and teachers to the 10th episode of Constitution of American Life. In this segment, we will be attempting to address the connective tissue between the ratification debates and the First Congress, as well as discussing the 235-year legacy of those debates. In the last analysis, we are hoping to help answer the question that every high school junior or senior asks: why should I know or care about what people decided in the late 1780s and early 1790s? In our last session, I asked the Friends of Publius if they could name the Academy Award-winning movie from the year that they graduated high school. I thought, since we're much more musically inclined than we are film, I thought it'd be interesting to see if they could name Billboard's #1 song from the same year, the year that you graduated there. I was surprised when I looked my own up. I do remember the song there. The artist I enjoy, but the song not so much. Professor Williams, there, are you looking?
No, I'm not. I'm thinking.
#1 Billboard hit for 1987.
Material Girl by Madonna.
Not bad. I think you're kind of in the genre. Not bad. Yeah. It was. I love this. I started chuckling. It was "Walk Like an Egyptian" by the Bangles. There, it definitely says so much about the mid-late 80s musically, in my opinion. Let's go back to the year 1977, Professor Kavanaugh.
It was the 70s. I don't remember much. If it was,
the thing is I think most Billboard #1 hits, most, not all, is music that we probably, weren't listening to at the time.
Right.
That's the thing. You are a historian.
If it wasn't put out by Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd, maybe some Beatles remix, I probably wasn't listening to it.
No, so, I will say it is an individual solo artist, male, and he is British.
Philadelphia Freedom.
Elton John.
No,
we're talking 77. Well, it might be 76.
It might be there, but it was "Tonight's the Night" by Rod Stewart.
Yeah, I was not listening to a lot of Rod the Bod back in the day.
Rod?
I'm not. If you're asking me about like Little Faces, back before he went on his own.
All Faces and Faces. Those are great albums.
That's the Rod Stewart I was referring to. Professor Moore.
I'll go with Elton John's Philadelphia Freedom.
See, and I thought that would be it, but no, it was "Silly Love Songs" by Wings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I was hoping that that you were maybe class of 75, because I know you love this song and probably sing it when you're in the car. "Love Will Keep Us Together" by Captain and Tennille.
Well, my wife is here in the kitchen. She probably would chime in on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, music, insurance coverage will keep us together.
That doesn't say a lot for Billboard right there. I'm sorry.
I'm just gathering the information.
You're the messenger. I know. Okay.
Yeah. So that is probably enough presentism for Professor Moore that he can take in one session. So let's head back to the second greatest generation, the founders and framers, and look at ratification and the First Congress. And let's start with our 18th century man, Professor Moore. It seems to me that the key issue that divided those at the ratification debate was representation. It also seems to me that, to a certain degree, that was settled, all right, at ratification as we go into First Congress. Am I accurate on that? Would you agree that the notion, I mean, of course, it's not 100%. Everybody's, holding hands and singing "We Are the World" about it, but it's a settled issue that doesn't come up in the First Congress. Would that be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I would agree to that, because "We Are the World," that was like maybe the song of the year at 81 or 82, 19.
I think it's a little later than that.
Yeah. I think you're right, David. I mean, they ratify the Constitution. The representation scheme is in the Constitution. Now, since then, we've been fighting about what good representation is and gerrymandering and all of that stuff. But I think, you know, the general framework of representation is a settled issue, right?
Although I do remember there was one class, I believe, for some school outside of Milwaukee at the national finals, who in the early 2000s or something wanted to abolish the Senate. So it's still an issue, I guess, in certain parts of the country.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that team.
So, well, so representation, which it seemed to be the key issue in Philadelphia, there. So if that is for the most part settled, what are some issues that kind of transition from ratification to Congress that are kind of big on the radar?
Well, one of the first fights that they have on the floor of Congress is the militia bill. I mean, in Article 1, Section 8, there's like 5 or 6 statements about Congress calling out the militia, arming the militia, supplying the militia and the Navy. And so, and in ratification, the Anti-Federalists are very wary of what they perceive to be a consolidated control of the militia. And those debates continue into the first Congress, the details of a militia bill. The second thing that comes up is presidential power in the form of removal. On the front end, the president has to have permission of the Senate for appointments, congressional consent, advice and consent. But they were talking in Congress about, well, should we create a law that says he also is required to have congressional approval if he wants to fire somebody? So executive power continues into the first Congress. There's a whole lot of Hamilton's economic plan that I think is a carryover from ratification fights about consolidation. When he wants to assume state debts, a lot of people are nervous about that because they see a consolidation of federal power. That's a ratification issue. The tariffs and the taxation power is also perceived as a consolidation power. That's a ratification debate. And I also think you can't underestimate all of the issues surrounding the Whiskey Rebellion. I mean, Congress calls out the militia, and it took a while. Presidential power, is he going to march full bore into Western Pennsylvania? With, you know, to what extent is this a monarch that has this military? That was a ratification debate.
Well, can I ask Professor Moore? Obviously, from a public policy political point of view, there's disdain, but was there a constitutional question about the taxation? Well,
you're assuming that all the ratification was a constitutional discussion.
Well, it is. I'm assuming it is, because they're debating ratifying and what centralized powers will exist.
Yeah, I think the Western Pennsylvania farmers saw the whiskey tax as an income tax, because they're not dealing with hard currency in the West. They used whiskey as a form of currency, and so they saw the tax as a direct tax on their income. So I think that may be your constitutional connection. I also think one of the quirkiest things I think of is actually funny about the first, if the first federal Congress can be funny. I guess here's my full-throated defense of the first Congress being hilarious. New Jersey can't get their stuff together. There's a wacky election that takes place, and they cannot get their representatives into the first house. And there's a lot of skullduggery. I love that word. In Jersey, North Jersey, South Jersey. And there's this debate about the elections that slated these representatives into the House. Well, this debate this goes on for 4 months after the New Jersey election. The first Congress has to decide whether to seat these delegates from Jersey. that's a continuation of a debate in ratification, because a lot of anti-federalists were fearful of the national government having a role in the time, place, manner, having a role in local elections. Anti-federalists saw that would be a consolidation of national power running roughshod over state prerogatives and how they wanted to run their elections. So New Jersey forces that question in the first Congress, and it takes Congress 4 months to sort it out, and they eventually kind of punt on it and accept in my view, out of pure political expediency, because they don't want to be the first Congress to prove the anti-federalists right that the National Congress was going to run roughshod over state politics. So I think there's a lot of things that carry over into the first Congress.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, am I correct in my understanding that if we look at the personalities of ratification in the first Congress, they're pretty much the same people? Is that accurate, or is there a distinctive difference between ratifiers and then those who are members of the House or the Senate in the first Congress?
Well, you're looking at 79 people, 20 senators, 59 representatives. You have some names, Madison being foremost among them, thanks to Patrick Henry keeping him out of the Senate. Elbridge Gerry, Richard Henry Lee, Robert Morris, Roger Sherman. So you have some, who's
crossover.
Who. But you also have some new blood. And I came across this quote from Madison that is really kind of funny, but he changes his tune. But initially and I'm going to quote, I've got to look at out of the book here, sorry. Worried, I see upon the list a very scanty proportion who will share in the drudgery of business. So Madison's looking at these guys going, these guys are a little shaky. But it turns out that, they do a decent job. They do a decent job. And I want to go back to something Tim had mentioned. I think one of the biggest issues was that dismissal of presidential power, because and it actually stems from something Madison had written to create the Secretary of State's cabinet post. So Madison's actually proposing that in the Congress, but then they're like, oh, how do we get rid of this guy? If we want to get rid of this person in this agency or in this post, how do we get rid of him? Oh, crap. The Constitution doesn't say anything about that. Yep. Who has this power? And so this early argument in the first Congress really sets the tone for constitutional interpretation, where the Constitution is silent. And then Madison said that, we didn't have any footsteps to follow in the wilderness. So holy smokes. Is this going to be something the president could do on his own? Is this something that it can only be done by the Senate since they have advice and consent? Is this something going to be done by the president and the Senate? So that argument was really, really important to move forward in terms of constitutional interpretation, as well as the Bill of Rights. I think the Bill of Rights argument, and not just the Bill of Rights, but is it going to be incorporated or a supplement? Is it going to be incorporated within the document, or is it going to be a supplement to the end of the document? And I think that was a really big debate that is a carryover from the ratification.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. Yeah, there's a lot of great quotes. Adams hated sitting in the Senate and listening to these numbskulls. I mean, here's Adam. There's a lot of great letters he writes home and tells Abigail that I have to sit and listen to these, he doesn't call them morons, but whatever the eloquent words were. So he's looking at a lot of backbenchers and not real happy with what he's looking at. He has to sit there endlessly in the Senate.
Didn't he believe that, being the presiding officer, that would allow him to engage?
Well, if he had any sense of history, and he did, and this is the irony, that he couldn't help himself, because if he had any sense and was bound by history, he'd know that the presiding officer doesn't engage in the debates.
But didn't he think he would be able to?
Yes.
Yeah.
But then when the debates go on into what should we call the new president? and Madison, or excuse me, Adams is pulling out what little hair he has left. Really, this is what we're debating. Oh, one other name I want to throw out too is Fisher Ames. He's kind of a young guy, not very well known, but he ends up doing some pretty good work in the first Congress.
Yep. So I want to build on something, Professor Kavanaugh, that you said. And I taught this to my students, that coming out of ratification, yeah, we got words on paper now, but they really have no idea what they have created and how this is going to look, all right, when it's put into action. So looking at, let's go to the end of the first Congress. To what extent do you think that they brought some clarity to the meaning and maybe some resolution to some of those big questions that Professor Moore touched upon, or any other big questions that you think were debated at that period?
Well, I think they brought a great deal of clarity, because just in the dismissal debate, I mean, it was Madison that finally kind of, I don't want to say he relented, but he said, you know what? If we're going to hold the president accountable through the impeachment clause for the carrying out of his administration, we should give him the power to be able to dismiss people within his administration. So there's clarity there. Certainly, Roger Sherman, in this big debate about whether the amendments, as they called them a Bill of Rights yet, whether it's going to be incorporated as Madison wanted, or it was going to be a supplement at the end as Roger Sherman wanted. Sherman and some of his guys, they kind of win that day and say, you know what, we're not going to incorporate this into the document for various reasons, and we're gonna tack it on at the end as a supplement. I think, which leads us to eventually calling it a Bill of Rights. So I think that is absolute clarity. And the other one too is the national bank. I think the national bank becomes an issue whether or not there's an inherent power within the government to create this bank. And obviously Tim alluded to Hamilton and his reports on manufacturing and how he saw the country moving forward economically versus his close personal friend Thomas Jefferson, and how he saw things moving forward. So I think there's some clarity there, because you tie that in with the state assumptions and of the debt, as well as where's our national capital going to be. So I think you see some definite clarity coming out of this first Congress. But you're right, David. I mean, they're looking at this and going, "Oh crap! There's some places where the Constitution is silent. We hadn't really anticipated this. How are we going to interpret it?"
One of the things they don't solve is to work out the nuances of the treaty powers. That doesn't come till mid 90s, and that specifically the Jay Treaty. That really forces in a sense, a constitutional discussion about, well, at face value, does the House have a role? Because they they wanted to stick their nose under the tent in the Jay Treaty. So I think there's and I would suggest that's a pretty big constitutional discussion that the first Congress doesn't get the opportunity to discuss.
So, Professor Williams, I'd like to kind of take a comparative angle at this. And we're going to talk, because Professor Kavanaugh has kind of already mentioned it, or maybe it was Professor Moore, sorry, I forget which one said it, about interpretation. That I think this question does lead us into 20th century and 21st century debates about interpretation. But I am wondering that, to what degree do other democracies have the same challenge as we do in the United States, as far as maybe some tension between those who wrote it and then the legislature that immediately now begins to implement it? Do other countries have that same kind of tension that we obviously do, I think, in this country?
It's such a good question, and I'm not positive. I mean, you're asking for like a breadth of knowledge that I just don't have at my fingertips. But
sorry,
no, because it's a really good question, because it made me really think through, like, what I consider to be not a little bit, it's ancestor worship, the kinds of things we do with our founders. From my just a superficial view, when I teach comparative politics, these are not the issues that show up in the textbooks, like different places arguing over what their founders of their constitutions are saying, either in that first Congress or today. So that may be something that's unique to the United States. I would encourage students to maybe poke around and do some research on that. I do have a couple. I want to talk a little bit about South Africa. Whenever I know, Dave, whenever you ask me for the comparative perspective, we just go, oh, let's talk about South Africa.
Yeah.
But I do think France is an interesting case that maybe the students should look into. In 1958, de Gaulle helped write the new constitution that brought in the Fifth Republic. And then his relationship with the National Assembly after that was contentious. And so I think that's an interesting maybe case study to look at in addition to South Africa. And in South Africa, for sure, you actually have the body that wrote the final constitution was elected in the office in 1994. They immediately turned themselves into a constitution writing body and took 2 years of doing that. And when they finished doing that, they became legislatures again. And immediately there are issues that show up around the death penalty, whether the Constitution allows for the death penalty or not, around rights to healthcare, rights to education, and the power of traditional chiefs, of which, while those different provisions were in the Constitution, there was a lot of different debates over the extent of how these rights and powers would actually be implemented. And there was a lot of disagreement and a lot of court cases that happened in the mid to late 90s over some of these powers and these rights, of which the very writers of the Constitution are making opposing arguments over what the Constitution actually means, whether it's getting HIV/AIDS medication or whether it's extending the right to education to rural areas, whether it's the power of chiefs. So you see it there for sure. I don't know enough about other places to know whether that is a unique situation or not, but it did happen in South Africa.
So, Professor Moore, as we said, I think this question very much leads to, all right, how do we ascertain the meaning of the Constitution? And I'm wondering your thoughts of which do you think should carry more weight, especially given to what myself and Chris said, that yeah, they got these words on paper, but they really have little idea of what this is going to look like. So consider that. But in your mind, what should carry more weight as we in the 21st century try to ascertain its meaning? The ratifiers or that the first couple of Congresses? I won't just limit it to the first, but the first couple of Congresses.
Yeah, there's oh man, really? Well, there's advantages and disadvantages. All right, let me give you 4 options. There are those who say we look to the convention for what the Constitution means. Now, okay, because that's, I think the argument is that's ground zero. Now, my thought on the other side of the on our pro-con chart here, that's 4 months of political bargaining, and I'm not sure that anybody's holding to rigid ideology. So I think and plus, I'm not sure you should put all your eggs in the basket of a group of folks who didn't do what they were supposed to be doing that summer. So I think the convention, to say the original meaning is rooted in the convention is a little troublesome. So now your option, this is Rakoff's argument in this great book, probably 25, 30 years ago now, still a fantastic book, Original Meanings. His argument is don't look to the convention, look to the ratifiers. Okay. And his argument is because they're taking a document and all of these conventions, these state ratifying conventions, they're really talking about ideas pretty rigorously. And you look at some of the debates that took place. I mean, my whole work is based upon what did people say during ratification about the Constitution. So now the problem there is, okay, now you've got 12 different conventions and over 3,000 people that were at these conventions. Is it possible to figure out what the meaning was in every one of these people? I mean, that's a great winnow job if you could do that. So now we go to the first Congress. They're the ones that actually are enacting and putting meat on the skeleton, so to speak. So the problem there is they're not a constituent body. They're elected politicians. working with a framework. So I'm not sure that it's a slam dunk there either. So your fourth option, well, is whatever the Supreme Court tells us the meaning is. Now, my problem there is 9 unelected folks. I mean, that debate has gone on in our history forever. So all I'm saying is maybe all of it.
Okay.
Maybe all of it.
Well, Tim, help me out here, because I'm thinking Madison said, I mean, he gave it, okay, the first thing you should do is look at the Constitution itself, look at the language itself, right? The second thing is then you look at the ratification debates at the state conventions. Then the third thing he said was look at the what I think the out of doors debates, referring to the Federalist writings and anti-Federalist writings. So that was he said the last thing we'll look at is the convention itself, because that's one of the reasons why he didn't release his notes. One of the reasons, right? Because he didn't want that to skew people in their understanding of things. So that was kind of his list of what you should look at.
Right. Well, I'm saying, Jim, well, first of all, he's inconsistent with himself if he wants to take his notes off the table is to discover what's going on at the convention. So I'm not sure Jimmy's we should take him seriously on his hierarchy.
Well, I think Madison's an interesting case study, though, because if you look at his early in Congress, right, where he is, and okay, so we're debating how we're going to interpret this Constitution because, oh crap, this is not here. How are we going to do this, right? Whether it be able to dismissal, whether it be the Bill of Rights, whether it be the National Bank or these other issues. But then later in his life, when he's retired at Montpelier, and he's thinking, man, we're kind of stuck in this language, and maybe we need some new ideas. And he referenced back to, I think it's Federalist 37, where he talks about sometimes just our own language is so just not good enough to be able to truly understand the issue. So he changes because he sees what's going on in the 1830s in the country, in the debates over secession, the debates over slavery, the debates over state versus national government. So he kind of changes a little bit in terms of his interpretation of this document that's set in stone, so to speak.
I think he's a little disingenuous. I mean, Chris, you know this. I don't need to remind you of this. Look, if he was really interested in the ratifiers and what they were saying, his Bill of Rights would have been a very different Bill of Rights. So he's not paying attention to the ratification people at all when it comes to a Bill of Rights, because he comes out with a Bill of Rights, not amendments, structural amendments.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's not willing to give us a peek under the tent with his notes.
Tim, he's a politician.
I'm just saying,
he's a politician.
I understand your argument, but I just think there's I guess I'm not buying it, I guess.
Okay, well, he was a politician, so the idea you want to get elected? Okay, I'm going to promise this. You want to keep from a second convention? Let's do this. And yeah, I am not going to put in any structural amendments because we're not changing this thing at all. I'm going to throw out some personal rights for you all, and you all can be happy with that, and we'll move forward.
Well, I'm wondering. I'm on a limb. I just don't know how far I want to go out with you guys on that limb here. But in reading this question, it seems to me there's no other direction you can go in other than to advocate living constitutionalism. And I know we're all familiar with that term. But to contradict Scalia's famous phrase, that it's a dead constitution, it seems to me this points in the clear direction to living constitutionalism. How far out in the limb am I, gentlemen?
Well, I would say, no, but Scalia, if I understand Scalia, he's like, if you want to change, he roots the evolution of the system within the legislature, not the courts. So I think even there's an element of living constitutionalism in Scalia's theory. He just puts it within the Congress.
Yeah, and he's like it's not necessarily dead, but he said it does not have a heart or limbs or whatever, all the body parts. He starts listing in that famous quote, right? He says, if you want to change it, you have methods for changing it. It's called Article 5. You want to change it, get the legislature to do something. So it's like, don't rely on us to clean up the legislature's mess. Of course, you want to talk about disingenuous. We might want to dive into Justice Scalia, but
and that's my problem with it is if we take Tim's analysis, And all right, we go to the ratifiers, but there's some gaps, white spaces there. We go to Congress, there's gaps, white spaces. And so a component here is going to be 9 unelected justices. And if they can't go to ratifiers other than to make things up, as we've seen from time to time, they're going to have to breathe, some life into some principles and vocabulary that maybe neither the ratifiers or the first few Congresses did themselves there. So, Chris, I know you're going to love this question here. In the last 10 years of my teaching, I would suggest to my students that the reason why we were still debating some of the same issues as the founding framing generation is because the nature of man has not changed. We are, contrary to Jefferson idealism, we are still a selfish and power-hungry species, which means that it doesn't matter what the issue is, it's going to circle around maybe every generation, and we're going to be debating the same thing because in the last analysis, we're greedy, selfish people. You with me on that?
Yep.
That is one of the best questions I've ever asked. It's a one-word answer.
David, I got to be honest. I'm flashing back to a place. I think it was St. Louis. I don't know how many years ago. One of the people that's in these 4 squares, we're having a discussion about man making progress, and one of my colleagues, one of the fellow FOPs, have been telling me man has not made progress, and I'm like beside myself, going, "Well, what do you mean? We put a man on the moon. We're curing diseases." He goes, "No, the nature of man, the nature." As a species, as beings, we've not changed, and over time, as much as I protested at that time, I have come to see the light, so to speak. We haven't made progress. I mean, tell me out. Who was the historian that said when it comes to foreign policy, the Constitution was an invitation to struggle? Was that Morgan? Edmund Morgan?
Well, I don't know. That sounds right, but I don't know for sure.
And I just think of, and I always use this as an example with people I speak with, are the Pacificus Helvidius debates, because Tim alluded to this earlier about presidential power and the treaty power. Can the president get us unilaterally out of a treaty, or does he need the Senate? And so here you end up with the Pacificus Helvidius debates, and students is a small book. You can get this book, and I'll put it in the resources. It's a great resource because here you have Hamilton writing as Pacificus, and you have Madison writing as Helvidius, arguing about constitutional interpretation. Well, they were there at the convention. Now, Hamilton, not as much as Madison, but they were there. They were allies in its ratification. And so now it's put into practice, and they're going to argue over its implementation and the interpretation of it. So if 2 guys that were there that wrote the damn thing are going to argue over its interpretation and its implementation, how are we not supposed to? So I'm agreeing with your comment, David. Yeah, we're going to continue to argue about these things because we will. That's just the nature of humanity. But holy smokes, these guys wrote it and they argued about it. So I think we can all argue about it.
Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I think as much as I like being right, I think I'm sorry, that just slipped out. That slipped out, Chris. I think there's a constitutional reason why we still fight about this. I think I do think there's an element that the humanity is kind of in a steady state of weakness or fallenness, or how, that's kind of the philosophical thing. But I think federalism is another reason why we continually fight about these things. And that's much less that's much less philosophical. If we split power between nation and states, I kind of see that as a setup for continuing discussion about the meaning of the federalism principle itself. I think drives a lot of it. I also think too, to your point, David, that there's a question in there about human nature as well. But I think federalism can't be underrated as well.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with this. I'm just trying to put my head around. I agree that maybe the nature of man is selfish and greedy, but it seems to me the experiment, not just in the United States, but I think in most countries that set up constitutions, is setting up the limits of selfishness and greediness. And there has to be some either enforcement power or consensus on what are the legitimate things that we're gonna argue about? Like what are the constraints of the argument? And it seems to me that over time, as we add to the Constitution or as we make legislation, while we can be the same nature of man, the way we act out our selfishness and greediness may change based on the rules. So for example, like, oh my gosh, I'm tired. What's the decision about corporations can spend money? What's that decision?
Hobby Lobby? No, not Hobby Lobby.
Citizens
come on.
United.
Yeah.
Citizens United.
You had the historian do that? Ow.
Man, it's been a long day. Citizens United, it seems to me, it's just an example of like, the rules change and there's a floodgate of not something that people hadn't wanted to do. It was just that maybe the rules were preventing them. So it seems to me that, we can think about how we can construct different rules that will shape the selfishness or the greediness. And as long as we are abiding by the rules, the political elites mostly, then that will keep it somewhat in check.
Well, that was my reaction, is because I don't think it's the rules. I think it's the gatekeepers that allow those moving boundaries for how selfish or how greedy we can be. So I think the gatekeepers, and in this case, you're obviously referring to the judiciary, because as we've said on other programs, sometimes our legislative branch is MIA.
Well, and I think, Mike, I like the way you said that, Mike, because, I've always struggled with, one of the axioms of history. I think we give George Santayana the credit is, if you fail to learn history, you're destined to repeat that. And I think that's just a bunch of hooey there. Even if we learn it, we seem to repeat it over and over and over again. And so I am wondering, Mike, if you could identify if you can make a link, because this is, I think, a frequent question that students get from a lot of judges. A lot of judges will take historical topics and really want to bring it into the present, and have kids make this link and connections there. What issues do you see, in the 21st century that you would say are, there's almost a straight line back to the framing first Congress generation?
Yeah. Tim and Chris, please help me on this as
I'll give you two right away. I think Hamilton straight out of the chute comes out with a financial plan and it's perceived as big business. I think we still talk about the role of government in business. And holy cow, the Gilded Age. So I think we still are trying to sort out the relationship between government and its role in commerce. I also think, holy cow, we've been screaming about federal versus national roles in elections. My goodness. Is there a place for states to do their own thing, and is there a role for federal oversight? Holy cow. That's the last couple of years, that seems like the only thing we're talking about. I think those two come to mind for me right away.
Well, and I want to reinforce that, Tim. The level of angst and frustration in the Richmond household in the last few days has risen quite significantly with this, California. I guess it's not only the California bank, the Silicon Valley bank, but we seem to continue to have this debate, whether it was the 1790s about the bank and the fear of the power, about regulation, which again was, obviously not to the degree it was today. And here, and again, I thought the progressives and the New Deal, I thought it kind of fixed all those things. But here we are once again in 2021, 23. We're in 2023, aren't we, man? I've lost a few years there. And we've got the same dang thing going on, in which those with the power, the gatekeepers, are once again going to bail out the powerful. All right. Because I agree with you, Chris, that they're talking, oh, it's just the depositors. Who was one of those depositors? Who was a depositor who actually caused the panic? I think it goes, isn't his last name Thiel? He pulled out $40 billion, all right, from the bank, which is what started the panic to begin with. And by the way, I'm sure you know this, Chris, because you're on social media. What was it with it 24 hours before this all happened? They signed off on big bonuses for all the bank executives.
Yeah, I think that's a little up in the air, exactly that time frame right there. And I know that some of that stuff was actually being pulled out a couple of weeks prior. So there's hopefully there'll be some type of investigation. But yeah, David, it's a little frustrating in that regard that I think one of the things we still argue about today is one, regulation, the role of government. And I think the biggest one that was our favorite F word is federalism. I mean, that it was debated, from the jump, and we still debate ongoing to this day. Where does this sovereignty rest? Does it rest at the state level? Does it rest at the national level? How much should the government regulate? How much should the government not regulate?
I agree, but see, that's my frustration, is that I stupidly, naively, foolishly, idealistically, however you want to describe it, assume that from the progressive period we had finally come to kind of a consensus that when it involves Congress and big corporations and banks, that the federal government, has to have the authority here. And yeah, the problem is, they do to a certain degree, but the gatekeepers are always going to protect their own kind.
Well, as you were talking about this, David, reminded me of the original fight back in Hamilton's day, because he didn't want to make discriminations between who was holding the credit, who the creditors were. I mean, all these speculators held all of these IOUs from back during the war and during the Articles period. So Hamilton says, just whoever holds them, just come on in and we'll pay them. And there was this justice argument, like, wait a minute, what about Farmer Jones, who originally coughed up the cow or made donations to the Revolution, and he sold his IOU way back in the day. So that kind of, your description of the banking, the elites getting the CYA treatment is kind of similar to the Hamilton non-discrimination proposal that he had.
I would just say, students, see Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution, and the obligation of contracts. Yeah. So it's in the Constitution that we're going to make sure that states cannot just not pay money that's owed to people. So we see that from the very inception of the Constitution.
Yeah, and Mike, when I read this, and in our last session, we were dealing with the principle of equality, or and it still somewhat boggles the mind that here in 2023, we're in some ways having even more intense debates, in my opinion, than we were in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s about equality. All right, but and again, based upon the last session and what Professor Moore and Kavanaugh were telling me, they were having these debates, obviously very clearly. There were questions about equality, going on from day one. Do you think that's a link?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I feel better because I had some of those on my list as well, the ones that Chris and Tim were rattling off, and definitely political equality, like who gets to participate, I think is important. And I don't know, Chris and Tim, help me on this. The first Congress, there was a petition, right, brought that had to do with the slave trade, right? Or that was a debate that the first Congress was having. Am I right about that?
There was no debate. They said we can't do it constitutionally. So
okay. See, this is where I don't know.
Very quickly.
I think an obvious link is just like, I don't know whether we call it racism or we call it like the treatment of those who are most marginalized. What kind of protections do they get? I don't know my history well enough to know if that came up at all during the first Congress, like as a formal procedure. But in terms of a link of something that's still around for us discussing, that was definitely in the water back in the first Congress, I would say that students could focus on that as well.
Well, I would say the slavery issue is not in those debates, those early debates. Rarely were they debates about equality like we think of today and the immorality of slavery. It was more about the economic ramifications of how that would affect Southern economy versus maybe middle colonial middle state economies and Northern economies. So that is definitely that the debate of slavery is linked more towards the effect of the Southern economy as much more so than the idea of equality or the immorality of the institution.
Well, I mean, and we didn't, and I think you mentioned this in our last session, Chris, we didn't really delve deep into gender equality, but isn't there in the 1790s, questions or advocates for gender equality? I mean, is it Abigail Adams or is it Dolly? Which one says, don't forget the ladies?
Abigail.
Right.
But,
so
there's not much.
Yeah, it's
okay.
it's a struggle. I mean, it's a struggle. And again, I think we mentioned this in the last episode. You're not going to really start to see much until like the 1830s, 1840s in terms of women's movements, women's suffrage. You see it. There's an early, it's just somewhere. Help me out, Tim. Somewhere in Massachusetts for mill workers, women. Early on, mill workers, maybe in the late 1700s, there women are working in mills, advocating for more rights. But other than that,
well, it came out of the Lowell, the Waltham system. So,
well, I guess can we make this conclusion that in every federal style democracy there is no such thing as a resolved issue? Is that a conclusion we can all agree on?
Well, it depends on who you're asking. If you're asking some people that are currently on the court, I would say when they get confirmed, they say it's settled law, but I guess it's not. So that's my way of being somewhat
snarky.
In our last episode, we were talking about that quote by Justice Ginsburg, and in the interview there that she has that quote, she says that she refers to the great constitutional scholar Paul Freund, and she says, he said, quote, "The court should never be influenced by the weather of the day, but inevitably they will be influenced by the climate of the era." And she says that's what happened in the 1970s. She's talking about her role in changing the court's decisions around women's rights. So, I mean, I think that aligns with your point, Dave. I think that these are not going to be resolved. And even when they get to the institution that's there to resolve them, they're going to be resolving them in a way that's taking into account the current climate of the era rather than the climate in the 1790s. And maybe that's the way it should be.
Well, and I think about the poetry of Brown versus Board and the statement that in the field of public education, separate but equal is inherently unequal. And here we are in 2023, and we are in many ways more segregated, and our educational system is as unequal, if not more, than it was in 1954. Now, and which just again brings out to me the reality is that in our system, partly due to the nature of man, and just partly due to the structure of our democratic system, the idea that we can say we have settled this problem and we can move on, especially, again, I don't know if you guys have seen the latest numbers and stories on child labor in the United States here. And the fact that, again, we're still having these issues is can be very, depressing at times there. So we are coming to the end here of this session. And as we do, we always turn to our scholars and ask them for final thoughts, insights, and recommendations. So, Professor Williams.
Let me just say this. Maybe, I mean, I don't think you should lean into this for too long, but as we were discussing some of the issues that were and were not discussed by the first Congress, maybe that's something for you to think about. I think Sherlock Holmes had the idea of the non-barking dog as a key bit of evidence when trying to figure out a mystery, right? So maybe some of these issues that we're bringing up that just were not discussed at all, either because they didn't feel that it was important enough, or there was some legislative maneuvering to not make sure that it didn't come on the agenda. Maybe that's something to be thinking about, especially if you see these issues still manifesting themselves today. So I'll leave it at that.
Professor Kavanaugh.
I would encourage the students to get their hands on this book. Tim, you're going to have to help me with Professor Gnapp.
Jonathan Gnapp. He's the successor to Jack Rakoff at Stanford.
I would encourage you to grab that book because it is a fascinating read. It's thick, but it's footnoted and it's really good to help you understand those things. And of course, these debates are going to continue because that's back to Dave's question to me, because we really haven't progressed very much as a people. So, and the other thing to think about for students, as we continue to debate these issues, the stem of this question deals with Congress, and first Congress got a lot of stuff done. They had to. As Madison said, there were no footsteps into the wilderness for us to follow. So I would wonder to think about, the first Congress did a lot of work. Where are we right now with our current Congress? Is the work of the people being done by the legislative branch, the people's branch, of course, the House? So I would think about that as well. And if we are, that's great. If not, why not? So something to consider that way.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, Chris stole my thunder there with Jonathan's book. Another book I would recommend, it's shorter, but gives you a peek into the first Congress, and it's by Bickford and Bowling. Ken Bowling co-wrote this book, and the title is First Federal Congress. It's maybe 150 pages long, and it's kind of it's a breezy treatment of the first Congress. So if you get a hold of Gnapp's book and Bickford and Bowling's book, you're in good shape. I mean, I love this question because it essentially, I think, is asking between the lines, how British are we in our constitutionalism? Are we stuck in time, or do we have an evolving democracy, an unwritten constitution? So I think that's kind of lurking in the background here with this question.
So the students in Unit 3, you don't have a specific question on the judicial branch this year at the national finals, but it seems to me that the first bullet is clearly heading that way, as it asks you about the kind of the implications of this transition between ratification and Congress on the theories or ideas surrounding American constitutionalism. And so I would make sure that you're very comfortable with this debate over methods of interpretation, and that you be prepared to deal with the Alito gang there and their historic method of interpreting the Constitution that they've brought up in in numerous cases in the last year or so, as far as how they view history and how that relates to 21st century constitutionalism there. At this point, we don't know where we're headed in our next session. What we do know is that we have 5 more episodes that we need to produce, hopefully by early April, for you, to give you all the opportunity to, either laugh at our insights or maybe take some of those insights with you into your testimony. Until that next session, however, we wish you well. Peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.